Episode 151. Balancing the Elements.
The dragon tribe is divided into 5 groups according to the different elemental power they cultivate. Both the North and the South Atlantic belong to the water elemental dragon clans. The metal elemental dragon clans are the most unique out of the 5 elemental dragon clans since they are the most talented, have the greatest combat strength, and live up to unparalleled pride. They rarely participate in the dragon tribe's business and usually keep to themselves. Tom is one of the rare ones who travel in the mortal world,
Jade explained. Jacob never knew that the dragons were divided according to their elements. If he had not chosen to cultivate the Sword Shadow Scroll, which required the cultivator to gather the 5 elements simultaneously, he would have been a member of the Water Elemental Dragon Clan after reaching the first level. After listening to their explanation and pondering over the consequences of him attending Sophie's birthday party without breaking through to the first level, Jacob came to a conclusion. "Jade, Julia, I have an idea," Jacob said abruptly.
"What is it?"
They looked at him and said, "Well," Jacob's face turned serious. "Last time, when you measured the elemental composition of the nature essence in my body, my earth element was 7%, the lowest. However, the basic requirement of the Sword Shadow Scroll is to have a balance of the 5 elements. If I lower the amount of the other elements to that of the earth element, will it count as an equilibrium?"
"Master, it's,
Jade thought for a while and said,
demolition of your current cultivation progress."
"Can I try it?" Jacob asked. He knew that he could eventually gather enough nature essence one day, but it would take a long time. After all, Sophie's birthday was next week. He had been thinking about this method for days. If he couldn't gain a balance with a lot of nature essence, he could obtain one with less. It was like a chess game. You lose some pieces on purpose in order to increase the chance of winning the game.
"It's harder to gather nature essence than dispel it. Are you certain about this, Master?"
Jade asked. "Yes," Jacob nodded.
"Then I will teach you the spell that could dispel some of the other elemental essences in your body."
Jade leaned toward Jacob's ear and whispered to him. After memorizing the spell, Jacob smiled brightly and said, "Got it. You guys can go now."
"Farewell, Master."
The sisters smiled before turning around and leaving hand in hand.
"Sister, do you think Master will be in danger when he tries it?"
Julia asked Jade in concern as they walked out of the dorm area.
"There is no guarantee of safety in cultivation. However, the Sword Shadow Scroll is the safest technique, and I think he will be fine."
Jade raised her head, and her eyes sparkled.
"Well, our master is an extraordinary guy. Cultivators usually put the most importance on their nature essence, but Master is daring to dispel it to gain a better chance at advancing. He will definitely become an influential member of the clan one day." "Indeed. What he's planning to do follows the natural law of giving and taking. What he does is always within reason. No wonder I feel so much respect for him,"
Julia said. Meanwhile, Jacob stood where he was and silently recited the spell that Jade had taught him 3 times. Then, he checked his watch, walked out of the dorm area, and headed toward Susan's office. On both sides of the roads, there were banners promoting the art exhibition. The fact that the school lent the entire first floor of the library to Tom Lester showed its considerable support for his first personal art exhibition in the state. The arts faculty within their university had been an independent college that enjoyed a certain degree of reputation across the country a few years before, but it was merged into their university recently. The arts faculty's professors were all famous people in the art circle. However, The arts faculty had a building of its own and rarely crossed paths with other programs and faculties. It was more like an independent group. Hearing that Tom would be holding a one-person exhibition, the girls in the arts faculty were all excited, and the school hoped to further expand the influence of the arts faculty through his exhibition. After crossing the library, Jacob entered Susan's office in the administrative building. Susan was cultivating with her eyes closed, and she remained silent after sensing Jacob's arrival. Not wanting to disturb her cultivation, Jacob sat down across from her. In the past, he came here to cultivate nature essence and increase his strength. However, he came to dispel some of the nature essence today. If Susan had known about his purpose, she would have been astonished. The nature essence slowly circulated in Jacob's body while he began to activate the 5 elements, one by one, with the spell taught by Jade. He placed the elements into spheres and displayed them in midair, half a meter away from his chest. From left to right, they were metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. The amount of earth element was the lowest, at only 7%. Jacob cautiously dispelled the extra wood element through his fingertips, bit by bit. Right now, it was at 11%. He focused all of his attention on the process, knowing that it would be hard for him to replenish it if he accidentally released too much of it. If he released too much, he had to lower the amount of the other elements further accordingly. Jacob stopped releasing the wood element when he felt the amount was right. Then, he began to adjust the amount of the metal element, which was at 12%. By now, his face was covered in sweat, very different from his relaxed state in the past cultivation sessions. When the metal element was adjusted, Jacob turned to the fire element and water element. The latter had the highest percentage and thus took a longer time than the others. Feeling that the amount of water element in his body dropped from the original 54% to the insubstantial level of the earth element, Jacob felt a bit regretful. After all, that was the majority of his strength, and he had accumulated it through intensive cultivation. He had already taken a huge risk by choosing the Sword Shadow technique for his cultivation, and now, dispelling his nature essence was an even bigger risk that could lead to all his hard work over the months going to waste in seconds. He had to be extremely careful and precise with the process. At this point, Jacob was dripping with sweat. Feeling that the 5 elements before his chest had almost reached the same level, Jacob began to make some minor adjustments cautiously. Just like a water reservoir, it was hard to obtain water, but quite easy to release. Jacob released the nature essence in his body back into nature, and it would be hard for him to get them back into his body. After a long period of time, Susan opened her eyes slightly and saw that Jacob was soaked in sweat. For a moment, she thought that he had gotten into a mad and chaotic state. After she sensed no strange energy around him, she relaxed. Dashes of dim red, blue, white, and green light were released from Jacob's body. What is this guy doing? Susan was puzzled. Done! Jacob, who was sitting cross-legged, opened his eyes suddenly. With the balance of the 5 elements, his body experienced a fantastic sense of freedom. At this moment, layers of cloud gathered in the sky above the administrative building. Is he breaking through to first level? That was so fast! Alarmed, Susan looked at Jacob. After detecting what was in the sky, even Susan, who usually maintained a calm composure, was stunned. There was a small lightning cloud tribulation in the sky. Episode 152. Preparations for War. Almost immediately, the pure white clouds above their university turned dark. A dash of lightning flashed in the clouds, followed by a dull thunder. There were no bright lightning bolts, but sparks of silver light in the clouds transformed into light arrows that were unnoticeable to the mortal beings and shot into Susan's office.
Here they are.
Susan raised her hands in a hurry and spread out her array formation. However, the lightning arrows pierced through the 5 elemental defense array formation and shot toward Jacob. With Jacob's current strength, he absolutely couldn't see the source of the lightning arrows. Like an ordinary mortal being, he couldn't even detect them. Susan drew her long sword and activated Ice Frost Scroll to block them. The lightning traveled along her sword and numbed her arms a little. The scattered lightning in the room combined into a thick lightning bolt before crashing on Jacob's head. Jacob felt as if countless electrical currents entered his body. The first level of the Sword Shadow Scroll, 5 elemental array. Jacob sat upright while the scattered 5 elemental essences in his body turned into 5 elemental pillars. Cultivate using lightning. The balanced 5 elements were able to take on the lightning directly. The lightning entered Jacob's body and remained silent. Meanwhile, the dark clouds scattered and the sky was clear again. Looking at Jacob in astonishment, Susan put away her long sword and rubbed her numb arm.
Is it the legendary lightning cultivation? She thought. Strengthening the body with heavenly lightning and drawing power from earthly lightning? Stand beyond the 5 elements, dominate them, and use them with ease. The lightning cultivation that would allow the cultivator to advance in levels and realms through lightning tribulations.
Astonished, Susan looked at Jacob, who was still regulating his breath with his eyes closed.
Is it possible that the Sword Shadow Scroll is not at all a 5 elemental technique, nor a sword cultivation technique, but a lightning cultivation technique? The technique that could attract lightning in nature with the aid of the 5 elements?
A moment later, Jacob opened his eyes. A light appeared in his eyes before returning to the depth of his body. "Susan, did I make a breakthrough?" Jacob asked.
Let me see.
Susan forced a calm expression on her face before walking over and taking Jacob's arm in her hand. The 5 elements were evenly placed in his body, pure and clean. Although the nature essence was still weak, he had laid a solid foundation for future cultivation. After the initial strengthening by the heavenly lightning, the 5 elements in his body were no longer chaotic but well organized. The more Susan checked, the more surprised she was. She was so shocked that she forgot to let go of Jacob's arm and remained standing there speechless. She was honestly very impressed with what Jacob had been able to achieve in such a short span of time. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Seeing that Susan didn't let go of his arm, Jacob asked anxiously.
"Oh, you're okay,"
Susan responded and released his arm. "Just okay?" Jacob was disappointed. He had focused all of his attention on directing the lightning in his body and worked hard to keep the aggressive energy under control. However, Susan's words made it sound insignificant. Of course, if Susan hadn't warned him, Jacob wouldn't have prepared himself and would probably have his meridians destroyed by the heavenly lightning.
The Sword Shadow Scroll is different from the technique that I cultivate. However, I can feel that your strength is still weak, and you've just reached half first level, Susan explained.
Half first level? Jacob froze for a moment.
Your body has improved, but your nature essence is not strong enough for you to be considered a first-level cultivator. Your essence is very pure, but it's so weak that it's barely noticeable.
Susan didn't sugarcoat her words. With his spirits dampened, Jacob sighed.
It seems that the Sword Shadow Scroll is a lightning cultivation technique that is very powerful, but you must be tested by the heavenly lightning each time you advance your realm. The heavenly lightning will get stronger each time. If you can't defend it, you will be turned into ashes,
Susan continued.
Turned into ashes?
He asked, as his face turned pale. Jacob, who had been pleased with the elevation of his realm, suddenly felt like his heart was breaking.
And no one can help you block the lightning tribulation, including the sisters. The Sword Shadow Scroll is a 5-elemental cultivation technique, and you will be fine if you progress slowly. However, you must take risks if you want to elevate your realms,
Susan said. Jacob thought, since just lowering the 5 elements to 7% had triggered a lightning tribulation, then he did some quick calculations in his head.
Besides, the Sword Shadow Scroll requires you to cultivate the 5 elements simultaneously. After you reach the 3rd level, if you want to continue, you'll need to find a mystic crystal. However, it's challenging to find a 5-elemental mystic crystal nowadays,
Susan said. Susan's words reminded him of the trouble he might encounter in the future. He had not considered the mystic crystal when he chose the Sword Shadow Scroll.
Anyway, you are still far from it. Maybe you'll never need to worry about it,
Susan said lightly. On one hand, she wanted to give more warnings to Jacob. On the other hand, she felt like Jacob wouldn't be able to reach a high realm. She knew that her thoughts were contradictory, but she felt like it was her responsibility to warn him. Jacob's moods rose and fell with her words. He checked his watch before standing up and saying, "Time's almost up. I should go now."
"Okay,"
Susan nodded. Jacob was striding to the door when Susan said,
"You don't have to worry about Tom. As long as you are wearing the necklace I gave you, he would know that you are under my supervision and won't dare to touch you. Of course, things will get tricky after you reach 1st level."
"I haven't broken through to 1st level yet, have I?" Jacob turned his head and asked her.
"If I said you haven't, then you haven't."
Susan threw the words at him as she stood beside the desk with her head turned facing the window. Thinking of Jade's words, Jacob was silent for a moment before taking his leave. Susan was 1 level higher than Tom in terms of realms. However, Susan, who was a diligent cultivator but an inexperienced fighter, probably was no match for Tom in terms of combat strength. Anyway, it was a fight between the inspectors, and it was not his place to interfere. Sighing slightly, Jacob walked out of the administrative building. Since he left all the tutoring materials at Sophie's home yesterday before he went to the art district with her, he went to her house today empty-handed. Like before, he arrived at Sophie's home around 6:30, and he could smell the mouth-watering aroma of homemade dinner. The people who Jacob admired and appreciated the most were those who had excellent cooking skills, and Helen was undoubtedly one of them. However, when he pushed open the door and entered, he found that the house was crowded. Besides Sophie and her parents, there was Sophie's 3rd uncle, white-haired and amiable-looking elder Liam, short elder Frank in a long robe, and many others. In addition, a large group of bodyguards in black suits were standing around the sofa. Liam nodded at Jacob when he saw him come in, and his frown indicated that he was deep in thought.
"Jacob, you can go and have dinner with Soph. We are in the middle of a discussion,"
Helen said to Jacob. "Okay," Jacob answered before walking to the dinner table. Sophie was already at the table, eating silently by herself. Jacob walked over and sat beside her before filling his bowl with broth. Sophie didn't look at him. Her ears pricked up as she listened attentively to the conversation in the living room.
"This time, the South Atlantic is well prepared. It's said that their great master, who has not come out of seclusion cultivation for hundreds of years, will appear. I think they won't go back empty-handed."
An elder, whom Jacob was not familiar with, said,
"If they want to fight, then we will fight. We are not afraid of them."
Kenneth yelled.
"Elder Kenneth, be quiet."
A female elder in simple indigo-colored clothing glared at him. Kenneth shut up immediately, though only temporarily.
"I think we can agree to everything they have asked for except the one thing related to Soph."
Elder Frank looked up as he sat on the sofa and said to the people in the room,
"But this time, the Dragon King went in person and invited Elder David from the forest, who has not come out for more than 300 years. Whatever the South Atlantic wants, they will have to consider the force of the Wood Elemental Dragon Clan and won't be daring enough to engage in a fight," a younger elder said. "Elder David is alone and doesn't represent the Wood Elemental Dragon Clan. The most he can do is to surprise them at the birthday party. However, he will return to the mountains eventually. The Wood Elemental Dragon Clan loves to hide in the mountains and forests and doesn't want to involve themselves in our conflicts."
Someone else chimed in.
"I don't think the thing relating to Ms. Soph will cause a large-scale battle, but the conflict regarding territory is unavoidable. They have had their eyes on our southern region for a long time, and they hope to take over the lake as well,"
another elder reminded them. They are fighting for territory? Jacob began to sweat as he listened to their conversation. If he didn't know that they were immortal dragons, their discussions, and the black-clothed men who were wearing dark sunglasses behind them, would have made him believe that they were a part of a mafia.
"Okay."
Seeing that the elders were about to argue with each other, Dracon raised his hand and said,
"I've decided. I will not back down on the issue regarding Soph. As to the territory divisions, they are issues that we can negotiate on. After all, strength speaks loudest on these issues."
Dracon looked around at the elders and said,
"Elder Frank, you continue keeping an eye on the situations in the city. Elder Liam, your responsibility right now is to take good care of Jade and Julia, who will be strong enforcement in case we have to fight with the South Atlantic clan."
Dracon issued the instructions in an organized way. He was a real leader. The elders were listening to the instructions with their heads lowered when a series of knocks sounded.
"Who is it?"
Alert, Helen asked.
"Sophie's class advisor. I'm here for a follow-up visit,"
a voice replied. Episode 153. Follow-up Visit.
"Oh,"
Helen tapped her head.
"I completely forgot about it."
She quickly turned to the elders and said,
"Elder Liam, Elder Frank, please stay. The rest can leave."
"As you say, Queen." The elders all gently bowed at Helen and flew out the back window, lighting up the entire room with many different colored lights.
"Coming, coming!"
Helen rushed toward the door. She opened the door and said,
"Ms. Blue, what brings you here?"
Normal school teachers didn't do house visits, but Sophie attended a very prestigious private school that made sure that all their students were taken care of and kept an eye on.
"A routine visit after the midterms. I notified you last week."
Sophie's teacher walked in with her backpack and was shocked to see 2 guests sitting on the sofa with 8 men in black suits and sunglasses standing behind them. These are my husband's business partners. Please, Ms. Blue, take a seat."
Helen warmly welcomed Sophie's teacher to the other end of the sofa. Sophie's teacher carefully looked at the interior of the house before looking at Elder Liam and Elder Frank. Liam was dressed in a modern suit, but Elder Frank was dressed in a brown traditional robe. One was full of white hair, and the other was hale and hearty. The two of them sitting together made Sophie's teacher feel wry and uneasy, and the 8 buffed-up men in black suits who were standing behind them made her uncomfortable. Sophie's teacher had dealt with students and parents before, but never in a situation like this. She was so nervous that she didn't know what to say.
"Sir, we are leaving now since you have a guest here. Our business discussion can continue on some other day."
Elder Frank stood up and said to Dracon, "Let me walk you out," Dracon said.
"There's no need."
Elder Frank waved his hand and walked out the door with the men in black suits. Liam followed and left at the same time. These young men in black suits were the junior disciples of Elder Frank. They helped take care of the businesses in the city and helped run errands sometimes. They usually started off as bodyguards and security guards. Because their skills weren't developed yet, they couldn't dash and fly away at lightning speed like the elders. Therefore, when Sophie's teacher suddenly appeared for a routine visit, they could only follow Elder Liam and Elder Frank and walk out of the house. Sophie's teacher looked at the emotionless men in black suits shockingly and asked Helen cautiously,
"Is there something wrong?"
"Oh no, nothing's wrong. Our business partners had something important to discuss, and it's all taken care of."
Helen answered vaguely and gave Sophie's teacher a cup of tea, breezily changing the topic.
"Ms. Blue, you must be tired. It's very late already, and you still have to finish the routine visits."
"I couldn't visit during the day since both of you are working,"
Sophie's teacher said as she looked at the interior of the house once again. She realized that Sophie's home wasn't as luxurious as the other houses she visited, even though Sophie's parents were pretty influential in the city.
"Are they having some difficult times? Those men in black suits might be here to collect their debt. Maybe that's why Sophie hasn't been studying well. Family issues do affect the children."
She assumed and made up a story in her head.
"Soph, your class advisor is here for a routine visit. Come over here."
Helen waved her hand at the dining table.
"Okay."
Sophie put down her spoon and walked over slowly. Jacob hesitated for a bit and decided to follow her. Sophie's teacher had met Jacob before, and she had a poor impression of him since he wasn't able to concentrate during their meeting at all.
"Good evening, Ms. Blue,"
Sophie said.
"Good evening."
Sophie's teacher nodded. "Is Soph doing fine in school?" Dracon walked towards them while holding a cup of tea. He was frowning a little since he was worried about Sophie's birthday party, but Sophie's teacher, who was very observant, thought that he was concerned because of the business failures and debts.
"You guys didn't attend the meeting last time, and I have been wanting to talk about this since then,"
Sophie's teacher said. "But she did quite well on the exams, didn't she?" Dracon sat down and asked. Sophie and Jacob also sat down next to each other on the sofa in the middle of the room.
"This visit isn't about grades. It is about the problem of relationships,"
Sophie's teacher said.
"Relationships?"
Helen and Dracon asked together, confused.
"I knew that he didn't tell you anything about this."
Sophie's teacher looked at Jacob before turning to Sophie's parents and saying,
"Sophie is quite famous in school, and many boys like her. Recently, many boys have given her gifts since it's almost her birthday."
After hearing the class advisor speak,
Sophie frowned and looked at Jacob, as if she was asking him why he still hadn't gotten her a gift. All those birthday gifts, cards, and love letters she got from the boys at school had been thrown into the garbage bin already.
I've even heard rumors that she was meeting a guy who isn't from our school. That guy climbed over the wall to see her.
Sophie's teacher continued.
What?
Helen and Dracon started to get serious.
That boy's name is Jacob, and he was from another high school. You think that you'll sneak someone into the school without us finding out?
The latter portion of her sentence was directed at Sophie.
Jacob?
Dracon and Helen looked at Jacob and felt relieved. However, Sophie's face revealed her embarrassment. She had not thought about what would happen if her parents found out about the sneaking around, even though they already knew about Jacob and her. After Sophie's teacher saw Dracon's and Helen's reactions, she said seriously,
"This is serious, you know. I think we should take action against this guy."
Helen glanced at Sophie, and Sophie's face turned red instantly.
Right now, education is really important for someone of her age. Sophie's grades are starting to get better, and as parents, you shouldn't just focus on your business and ignore your daughter's education.
Sophie's teacher looked at Sophie and her parents as she continued to speak.
What about being engaged?
Helen suddenly asked as she interrupted.
Being engaged?
Sophie's teacher's mind went blank as she said,
Is this a joke? Sophie is only in high school. What do you mean by being engaged? What are you even thinking?
All right, Ms. Blue, we understand.
Dracon raised his hand calmly and asked,
Does Soph behave badly in any other way at school?
Otherwise, well, she doesn't pay attention to the lectures. She likes to chat in class, read comics in class, and even skip classes sometimes to go out. Also, she always gets into arguments with the boys during gym class. Once, while she was having lunch, she purposely spilled food on the clothes of a girl from another class.
Sophie's teacher continued to list out Sophie's notorious actions, and that made her look bad. Jacob turned his head slightly towards Sophie. Wow, she really hates Sophie, he thought. Sophie's face turned hot listening to her teacher go on a rant about her. She knew that she wasn't the best student, but this was definitely an exaggeration. Finally, she couldn't help but stand up and yell,
Ms. Blue, that's because they came at me first, all right? Should I just let them bully me and do nothing? Oh, yes, and one more thing. She argues with the teachers a lot,
Sophie's teacher said slowly. That did it. Sophie stood up abruptly and stormed towards the stairs. Jacob stood up just as quickly and followed her to calm her down. Sophie went to her room and slammed the door with a loud bang. Helen, who was in the living room downstairs, smiled awkwardly and said,
Ms. Blue, please don't mind her.
Jacob went to the second floor and walked to the door of Sophie's room. He tried to turn the door handle and found that it was locked.
Soph!
Jacob yelled from outside of the room, but Sophie remained quiet inside. 5 elemental essences absorb. Jacob put his hand on the metal door handle and used the Sword Shadow Scroll as he absorbed some of the metal elements and loosened the door lock's mechanics. The door opened. Jacob saw Sophie lying on her bed, and her eyes were red.
What's wrong? Are you crying?
Jacob closed the door and asked before walking towards the bed.
No, I don't want to talk right now.
Sophie threw a pillow towards Jacob and said, in a weepy tone. Jacob caught the pillow with ease and threw it aside as he continued to walk towards her.
I don't want you to see me like this.
Sophie buried her face deeper into the bed and covered herself with the duvet. I was a bad student as well. Jacob stood in place while he spoke to her softly.
Yeah, sure. You're so smart. You're just saying that to console me.
Sophie grumbled as she was still facing the wall. No, seriously. My grades were fine, but I never listened to my teachers. I always gave them headaches. If you don't believe me, you can go to my high school and ask. There was a pause.
Am I really that bad?
Sophie stopped for a moment and asked suddenly. No, you are smart, kind, and cute. Jacob kept his voice low and soothing.
Wait, how did you come in?
Sophie suddenly turned around and asked. Instead of answering, a gray sword energy appeared in Jacob's palm. Sophie's eyes widened and all the tears were gone, as if they evaporated.
You have reached first level already?
Episode 154. Kenneth's Disappointment. Yes, half first level, Jacob said.
What is half first level?
Sophie looked at Jacob and asked with a frown. That is, I'm not fully at first level yet, but my level is higher than before, Jacob explained. However, he wasn't clear about this himself. He only repeated what Susan had told him.
Oh, that means you haven't reached first level yet.
Sophie nodded, her face holding a little disappointment.
Soph, Miss Blue is leaving,
Helen yelled from downstairs. Sophie immediately laid on the bed and covered herself with the blanket, acting like she hadn't heard anything. Miss Blue embarrassed Sophie in front of Jacob with all the bad things she said about Soph during her visit. Sophie hated her to death because of that. As Jacob saw Soph's reaction, he had no choice but to go downstairs and say, Soph is not feeling well. She's resting in her room. Of course, the teacher knew that Jacob was lying to cover for Sophie. However, she didn't want to argue further, as she was visiting her student's house. She said,
All right, let her rest. Take care, Miss Blue.
Helen walked her to the door politely.
Anyway, as I said, I know you guys are very busy, but as parents, don't neglect your child's education. The reason I am here today is to communicate with you guys. I still have a few families to visit, so I won't bother you any longer.
Sophie's teacher turned around and said,
Thanks a lot, Ms. Blue.
Helen answered politely. Sophie's teacher nodded as she grabbed her small backpack and walked out the door. Suddenly, a man with a dark face appeared outside the door and almost scared her to death. Ms. Blue, are you leaving now? Kenneth said in his rough voice, as his eyes were wide open. Kenneth's appearance had always been vicious and scary. However, it was even more terrifying since it was nighttime and his face showed anger. Ms. Blue was so scared that she took a few steps back subconsciously.
I still have something to do, so I am going to leave now.
She walked by Kenneth, sped up, and ran away as if she was trying to escape.
Kenneth, why did you scare Ms. Blue like that?
Helen scoffed. She's just an ordinary human. So what if I scared her? Kenneth came in angrily. I heard everything. She kept saying bad things about Soph. She's lucky that I didn't beat her up. Continue with this nonsense, and I will remove your elder status, Dracon said angrily. But it's true. She's just an ordinary mortal being. She has no right to tell you and Soph what to do. She was questioning your parenting, and you both didn't say anything. Kenneth was not convinced, as he continued. Helen stared at him and was too tired to argue with him. She walked up the stairs and wanted to check up on Soph. Dracon wanted to scold Kenneth further, but he hesitated for a moment and decided not to argue. He walked away glumly towards his study room. There was only Jacob alone in the living room now, so Kenneth yelled, "Hey you! Come here!" Jacob didn't bother to acknowledge him and started walking toward the stairs. Kenneth was furious as he felt disrespected. Since he couldn't take out his anger on Dracon, Helen, or Sophie, when he saw that Jacob was ignoring him as well, he immediately threw out a dash of blue light to block his way. In the moment of desperation, Jacob formed sword energy in his palm and threw it toward Kenneth. "You haven't even reached the first level yet." Kenneth didn't even bother to look as he waved his hand. However, the moment his hand touched the sword's energy, a crackling noise was made. Kenneth felt strange and immediately drew back his hand. He looked down and found a small black spot on his arm with a small red burn mark. 5 elemental lightning? Kenneth was so surprised that he forgot to teach Jacob the remainder of the lesson. Jacob, on the other hand, didn't know what the 5 elemental lightning was. He walked around Kenneth and continued to step up the stairs. Kenneth wasn't willing to let it go just yet. He stopped Jacob and said, "Hit me again with that." As Jacob ignored him once again, he turned into a blue light and flew to the middle of the stairs, blocking Jacob's way. "Hit me again," Kenneth said in a threatening tone. Jacob has never heard a request like this before. He thought about it for a moment, formed sword energy in his right hand, and threw it towards Kenneth. Kenneth waved his hand and created a watery blue wave sphere to catch Jacob's sword energy. As he stood, blocking the stairway, Kenneth looked down at the sword energy and asked suspiciously, "Sword Shadow Scroll?" "What else could it be?" Jacob replied with an attitude. "But this sword energy, it is like a cloud of lightning," Kenneth mumbled to himself. He then suddenly slapped his thigh and said, "Oh, I understand now. This Sword Shadow Scroll is not a sword technique. It is a 5 elemental lightning technique." Because of Kenneth's shouts, Dracon walked out of his study room. When he saw Kenneth blocking Jacob on the stairs, he thought Kenneth was trying to embarrass Jacob. He yelled, "Kenneth, you better stop now." "Brother, it's not what you think." Kenneth was at a loss for words. This kid can release 5 elemental lightning." "Whom are you calling a kid? Watch your language." "Wait, 5 element lightning?" Dracon suddenly stopped his furious yelling as he processed his brother's comment and started walking toward the stairs. "You see?" Kenneth opened his palms, and gray sword energy wrapped in a blue water ball appeared. Dracon looked carefully and found that the sword-shaped energy was sparkling like a cloud of mini lightning. "This..." Dracon frowned. "Sword Shadow Technique is not a sword technique. We are all fooled by its name. This technique basically uses the 5 elements to create lightning. Forming a sword is a bonus, but creating lightning is the main point. It is not as simple as releasing a sword, but creating lightning within the sword's energy," Kenneth said. Dracon nodded and fell into contemplation. "I will contact General Arthur and ask him to change this Sword Shadow Scroll to a blue-grade cultivation technique." Dracon quickly went to his study room. Kenneth started to get serious, even though he rarely does. "That's why there was no improvement when I was cultivating this technique. I was going in the wrong direction. The sword energy, without the basis of the 5 elements, was useless, only to look good." He was crazier than Susan about cultivation. Kenneth was seized with remorse when he found out the secrets behind the sword shadow technique. However, since he had already reached the top grade 8th level, and considering the fact that he was weeks away from the heavenly tribulation, he did not have the time to recultivate and learn the sword shadow technique. "This isn't right," Kenneth mumbled to himself again while touching his chin. "Balance between the 5 elements. My body is all water element. How will I balance it? Furthermore, how can it be this easy to balance it this delicately?" His burly body almost blocked the entire staircase. Jacob coughed lightly to get his attention and asked, "Can I go now?" You can go." Kenneth moved aside, then continued to stand still and mumble to himself. "Perhaps this is the cultivation technique of human cultivators?" Thank God, Susan is not as crazy as him about cultivating, Jacob thought. He walked to the door of Sophie's room and pushed it gently as he walked into the room. All he could see was Sophie laying on her bed and Helen was hugging her head. At that moment, Sophie was saying something bad about her class advisor angrily. "What was happening out there? Was Kenneth giving you a hard time?" Helen, who was hugging Sophie, asked. "Nothing happened. He was just trying to see my cultivation progress." Jacob smiled gently. Then he looked at Sophie and asked Helen, "Is Soph okay?" "She is shameless. Of course, she's fine," Helen laughed. "Mom," Sophie complained. Helen smiled softly again and pinched Soph's cheek. She then asked Jacob, "I heard from Soph that you have reached half first level?" "Yeah, I had a little breakthrough after learning the sword shadow technique," Jacob replied. "I was wondering why your demeanor felt different today. It turns out you had a breakthrough again," Helen said. "Mom, how's he different today?" Sophie sat up from Helen's arms and asked curiously. "When Jacob came to our house today, I could feel that his spirit was strong and his eyes were clearer," Helen answered. "I don't feel that," Sophie said while she inspected Jacob. Jacob, on the other hand, stood still in his position as Sophie looked at him from head to toe. "Oh, his temperament does seem better than before. His eyes sparkle like the stars. It seems like he's even better looking than celebrities on TV," Sophie thought secretly as she continued to look. On the other hand, Jacob wasn't used to Sophie staring at him so intensely. As he felt uncomfortable, he tried to avoid eye contact with Soph and said, "Helen, I don't think I will come tutor Soph for a few days this week. I have midterms on Thursday and Friday, as well as next Monday and Tuesday. I need to study during those days." "Sure, no problem. Don't neglect your education to tutor Soph." Helen considerately nodded. She continued, "Oh, yes, I also want to ask you about something." "Sure, please ask." Jacob nodded for her to go on. "Last time you and Soph came to my studio, I thought you were interested in housing design. The studio has been quite busy lately, and we wanted to recruit an intern. The main responsibility is to handle some general stuff during the weekends, but you must have a little knowledge of graphic design. I was thinking that rather than recruiting someone I don't know, we might as well find someone we know. Our studio is a little famous in the country. If we hire someone who's not responsible, important information might be leaked." Helen was humble when she said her studio was a little famous within the country, while actually her studio ranked within the top 6 design studios. Helen's team was even involved in designing some of the most famous buildings outside the country. Jacob answered immediately, without any hesitation, "If it's not too hard, I can help." "Great, thanks a lot. We have been really short-handed lately. Once you finish all your tests, I will pick a time to teach you some basics." Helen smiled gracefully. "Okay. Seems like it's pretty late already. I think I'll start heading back now. Jacob said. Okay, Helen nodded. Jacob walked over and picked up some of the teaching materials he left behind from last time. Then he went downstairs and said goodbye to Dracon. While Jacob was leaving, Sophie, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed, suddenly turned to Helen and asked,
Mom, you know that his major isn't design, right? You could literally get anyone for your studio, so why him?
Helen avoided answering her question directly and instead said, with a gentle smile, Isn't Jacob becoming more and more handsome? Sophie's cheeks immediately warmed up as she said,
I guess.
Episode 155, Kathy's Help. Jacob got on the bus and went back to school. He had no idea how surprised Kenneth and Dracon were by their discovery earlier. Kenneth, as a top-tier 8th-level cultivator, had almost an immortal body. Even a full attack from an experienced cultivator wouldn't be able to hurt him. However, Jacob was not even on the 1st level yet, and he managed to give Kenneth a tiny burn mark. It was the difference between heaven and earth from the 1st to 8th level. If there was a real fight, Kenneth, who was on 8th level, could easily eliminate tens of thousands of 1st-level cultivators. Jacob fondled the sword energy in his palm as he solidified and dissipated it continuously. Although his cultivation realm couldn't be improved at the moment, the technique of forming nature essence into sword energies could be practiced. That was the difference between techniques and realms. To level up one's realm, one needs to absorb more nature essence continually. However, the improvement of the realm relied on both the cultivator's foundation and proficiency with the technique. Susan was in a higher realm than Tom Lester, but her technique and actual combat power weren't as strong. Just as General Arthur mentioned, technically, even someone with the lowest red grade technique could reach 8th level. However, the power of a red grade technique would be far weaker than other grades. Similarly, Jacob's realm was not comparable to Kenneth's, but his technique was something that Kenneth had to be careful of. The lightning technique that could break through other elemental techniques was more than enough to intimidate even Kenneth. The bus arrived at the campus very soon, and Jacob walked to his dorm, carrying his tutoring materials. The guys didn't play games today, and Sam didn't go for his training at the stadium. They were all revising the materials for their courses in the dorm. The midterm tests would start on Thursday, so they were all tense, especially Sam. He had failed the physics test 2 semesters in a row during his freshman year. Therefore, he couldn't afford another failure. Jacob put his things on the desk, freshened up, and climbed into his bed with a textbook. However, he wasn't in the mood to study. Secretly, he summarized the remarkable abilities he had acquired after breaking through the 1st level of the Sword Shadow technique. The cultivation method was not that difficult. It was about absorbing the 5 elements in nature into one's own body. It was a fairly slow process, even though he had the assisting accessories on his necklace. One of the fantastic things that it allowed Jacob to do was to dissolve the 5 elements in nature with the balanced 5 elemental array formation in his body. That was how he opened Sophie's door. He quickly absorbed and dissolved the metal elements in the doorknob. However, this kind of absorption could not be turned into the 5 elements that he could store in his body. The other thing was that the technique allowed Jacob to condense the weak sword energies that had a tiny bit of lightning in them. The reason why Kenneth got burned was that he didn't defend. On top of that, this type of attack was weak because Jacob couldn't control the sword energies properly and could only throw them out as if they were grenades. However, the sword energies could always become sharper and more akin to a sword after more practice. For now, the most important thing was to improve his technique. Jacob sighed as he put the sword energy away. Each of the 5 elements in his body had decreased to 7%. Although they were now balanced as a whole, this little amount of nature essence was still like nothing. Jacob's total natural essence had shrunk to 1/3 of what it had previously been. He could only advance to the first level after it became whole again. That was why Susan called it half first level. Certainly, balancing the 5 elements improved the sword shadow technique and enhanced its power. Jacob picked up one of his books and fell asleep while reading it. The next day, their university appeared to be very festive, with lanterns and banners hanging everywhere. One after another, fancy vehicles lined up from the cafeteria all the way to the library. Many famous people in the art circle came to attend this event. All the art major classes were canceled, and students were busy meeting the influential figures in the field who were rarely seen. However, this didn't concern the students of all the other departments, and the guys still needed to go to their classes. Since the midterm tests were on the day after, all the professors were doing final reviews for the students as usual. The key points that were mentioned during these reviews were usually questions on the exams. Therefore, Sam and the guys, who barely paid attention in class, were exceptionally attentive today. After the first class finished, Kathy walked to the back of the classroom from the front with a big bag in her hand. She put it on Jacob's desk and said,
I made a copy of my notes for all the same courses we have. As for the ones I took before, I found my old notes and made a copy of them too. They are all categorized by different subjects. Also, I highlighted the sections that would be in the midterms.
Jacob was surprised at how thoughtful Kathy was and didn't know what to say. He was planning to beg her for the notes after the class today, but had no idea that she made copies for him herself. She also included the courses that she had taken before and that he was taking this semester. She even highlighted her notes so he wouldn't waste unnecessary time. The guys beside Jacob were all astonished too. Kathy's notes were always the best in the class. However, no one dared borrow them from her. Usually, they would be thrilled if any of the girls would be willing to lend them their notes. But today, Kathy offered a copy of them to Jacob herself. Oh! The guys started to make a fuss as soon as they realized what was going on. Kathy flushed.
Good luck. I'm going to go have lunch.
Okay, Jacob said. After thinking for a bit, how much was it to make the copies? I'll pay you back.
It's nothing. Don't worry about it.
She turned around, went back to the front, and walked out of the classroom with her friends. Jacob glimpsed at the thick stack of materials that piled up in the bag and thought, nothing? It's as thick as the mechanical engineering textbook. The guys in the back shouted as Kathy exited the classroom, Jacob, I'll buy you breakfast for 10 days if you lend that to me to make a copy. Lend it to me first, and I'll give my items in World of Warcraft to you. Me too. I'll treat you and your roommates to beer and pizza. If anyone's getting a copy, it has to be his roommates first. Others should get in line. Sam, who was very stressed about the midterms, suddenly got excited and shouted incessantly. In their eyes, Kathy's notes were more precious than any treasures. It was just that they weren't close enough to borrow it directly from her. Since she was always the top student in the class and won full scholarships every semester, who wouldn't want to take the shortcut and use her notes to study for the tests? Seeing the crowd getting bigger, Jacob said loudly, You can all get a copy, but don't rush and don't tear up the original copy. You're in charge, Sam. Sam straightened up his back dramatically and held the bag in his arms. Here, here, here. Call me sir first, and then I'll let you have a copy. Let's see who still has the guts to call me Shorty. Huh. Ryan, since you beat me in Call of Duty the other day and called me a sucker, you're going to be the last one. Since Kathy gave the copies to Jacob in front of the class, she wouldn't mind him sharing them with the other guys. Plus, she was not that kind of person. She had always helped patiently whenever the girls in the class had questions. She was always treated as if she was made of gold right before they had any tests. On the other hand, Jacob and the guys were comparatively too shy to ask Kathy for help, let alone borrow her notes. Hence, they never had the opportunity to enjoy her gift. Jacob shook his head as he saw the guys' excitement. He walked out of the classroom and headed to Susan's office. The streets were busy, but Susan's office was so quiet that one could even hear a pin drop. In Jacob's mind, Susan had always preferred quiet. As the regional inspector, she was dedicated to cultivation. In her theory, governing by non-interference was the best way. Jacob pushed the door open and saw her cultivating with her eyes closed. A ray of red light, which indicated the metal element, and a ray of blue light, which indicated the water element, reflected onto each other and surrounded her as a mixture of purple appeared. The purple light was not settled. It throbbed up and down, akin to the heartbeat. Then, it started to throb even faster. Would she break through again? Strange how I said again. Jacob stood at the door, surprised and bewildered. Episode 156, Susan's Breakthrough. The purple light expanded, and the air pressure in the office changed with it. Jacob was forced 3 steps back, and his back touched the door. Susan exhaled deeply before opening her eyes. A bright purple light flashed in them before vanishing. She turned to look at Jacob at the door and said lightly,
"You can go on with your cultivation while I take a rest."
"Did you make another breakthrough?" Jacob walked over and asked her casually. Susan didn't want to answer him, but she said, after a moment of consideration,
"It's not a breakthrough of realms, but a cultivation technique."
In the profound cultivation palace in the Dragon Palace, Jacob had flipped through the ice frost scroll that Susan had been cultivating and knew that the technique was divided into 9 levels. The cultivation technique was mainly water elemental, while its offensive power was metal elemental. It was perfect for Susan's metal-water body type. Even as a master of 8th level, Susan had not reached the highest level of the ice frost scroll yet, which showed her indifference to techniques. She paid more attention to the elevation of cultivation realms. Probably due to Tom's taunts, she advanced to a new level in the ice frost scroll.
"I'm in a good mood today. You may ask any questions you want,"
Susan continued as she stretched her legs from exhaustion. "Will you show up at Tom's art exhibition?" Jacob asked. It was 4 o'clock, and the cultivation session would end at 6, which was when the exhibition would start.
"Depends,"
Susan said. As if she was struck with a thought, she turned to Jacob and asked,
"Regarding my class, how's your exam preparation going?"
"Actually, I haven't begun yet." Jacob didn't expect this question, but he had to admit that her class was the most difficult one this term.
"I see,"
Susan nodded.
"This exam will be very hard. You must prepare for it,"
Susan said. "Well, okay." Jacob broke into a sweat.
"Now that you have balanced the 5 elements, you can formally cultivate the Sword Shadow Scroll. In fact, after the breakthrough of the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll, the acupoints in your body have been unblocked. It means that you have reached the realm of a martial arts master in the mortal world. If you want to continue to 1st level and up, you must unlock the openings in the Dragon Core."
Jacob listened to Susan's explanation more attentively now, compared with during her class, since it concerned his life. Cultivators were, in fact, stealing the essence from nature, which was an act against the natural law. If the cultivators were not careful, they would be turned into ashes.
By reaching the first level, you will unlock the first opening in your dragon core. The higher the realm, the more openings will be unlocked. Sophie's third uncle has reached top-tier 8th level and unlocked all 368 openings in the dragon core. Then, the next step is to pass the heavenly tribulation and become a heavenly dragon.
Jacob nodded and thought, no wonder Susan said that I'm not at first level yet. Although the dragon core in my body is silently absorbing the nature essence, the amount is not enough to unlock even one opening. Only after he unlocked the first opening in the dragon core would the dragon core be fully activated. By then, he would have become a real member of the dragon tribe.
The more openings you unlock, the more nature essence the dragon core can absorb, and the stronger you will be. After you reach 5th level and unlock 232 openings, you will have the ability to transform into a dragon.
Transform into a dragon? Jacob was amazed. A golden-scaled dragon? If one can transform into a dragon at 5th level, why does one need to pass the heavenly tribulation and become a heavenly dragon? Jacob asked immediately.
Peak 8th level is not the real end. Only after you pass the heavenly tribulation can you become a true immortal golden dragon. That is the ultimate dream of the cultivators in the dragon tribe. You won't understand it, Susan said.
Discouraged, Jacob remained silent. He felt like the distance between him and Susan was like the distance between the ants and humans. The humans could understand all the behavior of the ants, but the ants couldn't understand what the humans were thinking and doing. I'd better turn my mind back to cultivation and try to reach the first level. Without any more questions, Jacob sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes. Protected by the array formation, Susan's office was an excellent place for cultivation. Watching Jacob cultivating, Susan smiled lightly and thought,
this guy doesn't like unrealistic dreams. With his diligence, he will reach at least the 3rd level without a doubt. However, his progress with the Sword Shadow Scroll will be slow.
Oblivious to Susan's gaze, Jacob closed his eyes and calmly absorbed the nature essence. By now, the 5 elements in his body had formed a small 5-elemental array formation around the dragon core. Each trace of the nature essence he absorbed would be automatically broken down into the 5 elements, and they would enter the 5 small spheres around the dragon core. Although the traces of nature essence were weak, the process continued without stopping. Time ticked away, and Susan, who had been observing Jacob for 2 hours, suddenly saw that it was almost 6 o'clock. Jacob also sensed that the time was almost up, so he opened his eyes. Seeing it was already 6, he stood up and was ready to take his leave. He asked abruptly, "Will you go?" Susan turned to the window and looked at the sunset. After a moment of silence, she grabbed the key to the office and said,
"Let's go."
He was surprised that she agreed to go. He only asked to be polite and was certain that she wouldn't like to go to such a crowded place. Jacob walked with Susan out of her office toward the cafeteria. Although Susan didn't need to eat mortal food, Jacob had to have his dinner. It was during the peak hour, and the students were amazed to see the beautiful Susan walking into the cafeteria with Jacob. "Wow, are my eyes playing tricks on me? Is it really Susan? Is he the guy who had an arm wrestling match with Michael at the bus stop?"
"He's the same guy who defeated Michael in the rock climbing competition."
The gossip began to buzz over the cafeteria while the guys and girls all looked toward Jacob and Susan curiously. Susan didn't eat. She just quietly sat across from Jacob and watched him eat. Jacob felt conscious and paid more attention to his table manners. It was no big deal for a teacher and a student to have a meal together in the cafeteria. However, since Susan was the famous ice queen of the university, her appearance in the cafeteria with a student was sensational. Uncomfortable because of the stares coming from Susan and the other students in the cafeteria, Jacob finished his meal quickly before walking toward the library with Susan. Jacob knew that he would become the common enemy of the guys sooner or later, but he had no time to worry about that now as he followed Susan into the library. In the hall on the first floor, the lights were positioned well, and the boards divided the spacious marble-floored hall into independent sections in which different styles of Tom Lester's paintings were displayed. It was only 6:30. According to the rules, the students were still not allowed in here. Since Jacob was walking together with Susan, who was a teacher, he slipped into the exhibition with her. There were all kinds of paintings on the walls, including oil paintings, gouaches, drawings, and sketches. Tom's famous Impressionist paintings were displayed in another secluded section. Tom was an inspector of the Dragon Tribe. In the mortal world, he was a genius artist who was highly regarded around the globe. Having received some education from Sophie when they visited the 1825 Art District a couple of days ago, Jacob could see the excellence of the paintings. Dressed in a black suit, Tom looked dashing. Right now, he was talking with some of the influential figures in front of one of his huge oil paintings. His handsome face, resonant and magnetic voice, and golden eyes all added to his charisma. If Jacob didn't know that this man was an inspector, he would undoubtedly have regarded him as the perfect man. Equipped with his great talents and eloquent speeches, it made sense why countless women worshipped him. In addition, the rumors only added to his mystery. It was said that he also had extraordinary talents in music and had amazed the crowd when he played the piano at a private party hosted by a famous music director in Hollywood. Seeming to have sensed Susan's arrival, Tom paused his conversation and turned abruptly. Spotting Susan in the hall, he immediately left the great artists and hurried toward her. Episode 157, The Exhibition. "Sue, you're here!" His voice contained a lot of confidence. It was obvious that he was very pleased to see her. However, Susan ignored him and turned to another small section. She looked around at the paintings as Jacob followed her. Tom's expression changed due to the cold treatment he received, but he regained his composure quickly. He quickened his steps and stood before Susan. "Sue, if you are interested in the paintings, I will be your guide." "I'm here to check if there's anyone here who's not supposed to be here. I have no interest in your paintings," Susan said coldly. "I know this is your territory, but you don't have to treat me so coldly. Don't you know that the purpose of my holding this exhibition here is to show you the achievements that I have made in the past 2 years? Tom pleaded. He glanced at Jacob, who was standing beside Susan, and found him annoying. However, he didn't want to anger Susan right now by attacking Jacob. Susan didn't answer. Instead, she continued to walk forward. Seeing Tom following around a beautiful girl, some of the influential people in the art circle all looked at them curiously. Tom kept his fury in check and forced himself to step away graciously, allowing Susan and Jacob to walk into the depths of the hall. "You'd rather stay with a guy who isn't even on the first level than speak to me? I can kill him like an ant. Also, I still need to repay him for the 6 slaps." Looking at their backs, Tom's golden eyes had a gleam of cold hatred. In one of the intersections of the exhibition, Susan turned her head abruptly and asked Jacob,
"Aren't you afraid?"
"Of what?" Jacob asked.
"Of his revenge,"
Susan said. "I have offended him already, so it won't hurt to give him another reason to hate me. Anyways, arrogant people always think that others are in the wrong instead of blaming themselves," Jacob said. With a smile, Susan turned to another section. Susan was smart, and she knew what Jacob meant. In fact, if Tom weren't disgustingly arrogant, she wouldn't have made this patrolling inspector her enemy. She liked to take things slow and didn't like Tom's arrogant attitude. This man thought that he was the center of the world and was nothing less than perfect. They turned to the section of Impressionist paintings when Jacob suddenly sensed people moving toward him. He looked up and saw Kyle and his basketball team. Today, the players on the basketball team were all wearing black ties instead of jerseys. Although the others were obviously uncomfortable in suits, Kyle looked majestic in his formal wear. "Why are you here?" Jacob asked. Having worked with Kyle once, he was not afraid of the big guy anymore. "They train all day in the stadium, and I'm afraid that they'll fall behind with other aspects of life. So I requested the principal to arrange for a few tickets and brought them here to have a taste of art," Kyle explained in his rough voice. Jacob was surprised, unable to place the sweaty basketball players and art in the same picture. "This is a gouache, which has different characteristics from oil paintings since gouache is opaque. Besides the difference in painting methods, the oil paintings give people a thick and heavy feeling, while the gouaches have a brighter touch," Kyle began to explain to his teammates. Hearing Kyle's precise explanation, Jacob was even more surprised. "This is another blow. Even the basketball junkie Kyle is more artistic than me." Jacob was mortified, wondering if the world had progressed too fast for him or if he had lagged behind too much. "Our captain does oil paintings." Seeing Jacob's mortification, Bear, who was friends with Jacob, came over and told him. "Oil paintings?" Jacob was dumbfounded. He imagined the giant Kyle sitting on a small stool while putting fine strokes on an oil painting and blocking the whole canvas board with his body. With excellent academic performances, a full scholarship from the university, superb basketball skills, and a talent for oil painting, Kyle was indeed an all-rounder. "Has Kay talked to you recently?" Kyle turned his head abruptly and asked Jacob. "Oh, no, the midterm exams are only days away, and she has all her attention on studying," Jacob answered. "Okay," Kyle nodded. "And you and she are childhood friends?" Knowing that the secret was out, Jacob smiled in embarrassment. Nodding, Kyle threw his arm around Jacob's shoulders. "After this year's National College League, I will go to New York for my postgraduate degree. I entrust Kay to you." His words were meaningful, and his arm was heavy. Feeling his sincerity, Jacob gritted his teeth and nodded. In the past, Kyle was the one who took care of Kathy at school. Now that he was in his senior year and about to graduate soon, his greatest concern was his younger sister, who seemed to be quite excellent but actually a bit naive. After patting Jacob's shoulder twice, Kyle didn't say anything else. He led the basketball team to the next section. The players, dressed in suits, were all uncomfortable being there, but they had no choice since their captain insisted that they should learn more about art.
"Kyle would be close to the Khanate realm of martial arts if he lived in the past,"
Susan said abruptly. "Khanate realm? The realm equal to the third level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll?" Astonished, Jacob turned to look at Kyle's back. Is it possible for one to reach the highest realm that is attainable by a mortal being by only playing basketball?
"With his powerful aura and strong focus, he could have entered the cultivation world with martial arts. However, for a mortal being, he has reached his limit.
Standing beside Jacob, Susan said lightly,
"Miss Susan!"
A crisp voice sounded abruptly. Jacob turned his head and saw Kathy and her roommate walking toward them from another direction. It was Kathy who called out to Susan. Seeing Kathy come over to her, Susan smiled. It was an unusual act for her.
"Why are you here?"
With Kyle's words still in his ears, Jacob asked Kathy.
"Kyle got me 2 tickets. Otherwise, I would still be outside in the long line. Students are not allowed in until 8 o'clock. We got the tickets and came here on our way back from the night study so we could relax a bit,"
Kathy told him. In her white t-shirt and soft black long jacket, she looked simple and elegant.
"Yeah, he just passed by us," Jacob said. "Okay, I'll go find him later."
Since it was no longer a secret that she was Kyle's younger sister, she didn't bother to cover it up. She looked at Jacob and Susan and asked,
"Miss Susan, did you come with Jacob?" "Yes,"
Susan nodded. Kathy pursed her lips, and a complicated emotion appeared in her eyes. She had heard that Susan and Jacob were close, but it felt different when she witnessed them together.
Will the exam be difficult?"
she asked again.
"You are the best in the class, so you don't have to worry about it,"
Susan said with a smile. Kathy felt humbled by Susan's dazzling smile. After a moment of consideration, she said,
"You two go on. I'll go find my brother." "Okay."
Susan nodded slightly.
"Susan!"
Another crisp voice sounded abruptly. Jacob turned again and saw Sophie coming towards them with Helen. Sophie left Helen behind and started running towards Susan. Susan smiled helplessly and placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder to stop her from throwing herself into her arms. After all, she was an inspector and was supposed to keep her distance from the clan. However, she couldn't resist Sophie when the latter was always so enthusiastic about seeing her.
"Mrs. Helen, you came as well?"
Tom came over with a few people from the art circle. Politely, he introduced to the others,
"This is Helen, the owner of LOM Design Studio."
The people in the art circle obviously had heard about LOM Studio since they all looked very impressed.
"Hello, I'm here to see the exhibition. Mr. Lester's paintings never fail to astonish me,"
Helen said with a smile. She came today for 2 reasons. One was to bring Sophie to the exhibition and have fun, while the other was to take this opportunity to meet Tom. After all, this was their territory, and she needed to meet this inspector informally first, using her identity in the mortal world.
"I think Kyle has left. I couldn't find him."
At this moment, Kathy returned. Tom was still enraged by Kenneth's threat from a couple of days before. He was planning to give Helen a hard time as an inspector, but stopped as Kathy came along and joined the group. He exchanged some polite remarks with Helen before leading his party to the other sections. Helen had a bad feeling about Tom as she observed him some more. Episode 158. A Painting for Love. When Sophie saw Kathy, she immediately became hostile. She found that every time she came to this college, this beautiful Kathy was around Jacob. It had become a pattern. No wonder she took Kathy as her rival. She had half a mind to say something to Kathy about it, but later decided that it wouldn't be worth it.
"Let's see the exhibition together, then,"
Helen said pleasantly to Kathy and Susan.
"Okay."
Kathy had met Helen last time in the stadium. Knowing that this woman was gentle and considerate, Kathy was quite fond of her subconsciously. In the world of science, she admired Mila, but in life, she wanted to be successful and graceful at the same time, like Helen.
This is an impressionistic landscape painting, which is usually...
Helen was telling Sophie this while appreciating the paintings. The others also listened to her quietly. Jacob knew that Sophie's knowledge of art all came from Helen. Someone as young as Sophie was already several levels higher than him in art appreciation, so Helen's knowledge was way beyond his imagination. Listening to the explanations, Kathy was more and more amazed. Under Helen's guidance, she began to understand the details that she would have missed. Glancing at Jacob, who was also listening attentively, and looking at Sophie, who kept talking to her mom, showing her knowledge as well, Kathy suddenly remembered the art books that Jacob had borrowed. She wondered if the reason behind Jacob's sudden thirst for art knowledge was this girl. After they finished walking around on the first floor, Helen had given them a thorough lesson about the paintings. Jacob had learned a lot, and Sophie was feeling proud of her mom. She could see the passion with which her mom talked about art, and wanted to have that sort of passion for something one day. Kathy admired Helen's knowledge and soft behavior. Glancing at the babbling Sophie, she wondered if she could really grow into a gentle and elegant woman like her mom. It was now 8 o'clock, and the students who were waiting outside in line finally could enter the exhibition. The quiet hall suddenly became lively. Liam brought Jade and Julia into the hall. The moment he saw Helen, he hurried over.
"Hello, Principal Liam,"
Helen greeted.
"Ah, Ms. Helen, how are you?"
Liam asked, in a slightly tentative voice. Together with Liam were some directors of the art program. He introduced,
"This is Ms. Helen from LOM Design Studio. Her husband is Dracon, the chairman and CEO of MTX Group, which is the biggest donor of our college."
LOM Design Studio was well known among the teachers of the art program, and her identity as the wife of MTX Group's chairman made them even more respectful. After all, the buildings and the advanced facilities of the art program were all funded by MTX Group.
"It is an honor to meet you, ma'am."
They lined up to shake hands with Helen. Half of the development funds for the university came from Dracon's company, the biggest corporation in the city. In fact, MTX Group funded all the expansions of the university which were not covered by the government grants, including the facilities, benefits for the teachers and students, development and research branches, and all kinds of guest lectures. The rapidly growing reputation of the university was attributed to the generous donations of Dracon's MTX Group. Standing beside Helen, Kathy heard Liam's introduction, and her eyes widened slightly.
"This elegant and down-to-earth woman is in fact the wife of the chairman of the biggest corporation in the region, and Jacob is tutoring their daughter," she thought.
In short, Sophie's family controlled the MTX Group, and MTX Group was the big hidden boss of their university.
"No wonder Vice Principal Liam is so respectful towards them," she thought. "Master!"
Jade and Julia rushed over, and they each took one of Jacob's arms. They didn't care about where they were. The students gushing in from the entrance happened to witness the intimate behaviors of the sisters toward Jacob. Even the teachers of the art program who were standing beside Liam saw it. However, since the girls were Liam's granddaughters and Liam didn't show any disapproval, they just pretended that they didn't see anything. Therefore, the students saw Jade and Julia clinging to Jacob blatantly in front of Vice Principal Liam, while the teachers around them just watched with smiles on their faces and awkwardness in their minds. The students gasped.
"This guy is so extraordinary that even Vice Principal Liam doesn't mind him clinging to his granddaughters."
Hurriedly, they memorized Jacob's look and reminded themselves not to mess with this seemingly plain guy. At this moment, Michael cut the line and walked in with the members of his rock climbing club. Although dressed casually, he was the most dashing one among the guys. When he saw Jade and Julia clinging onto Jacob and Susan standing beside him, Michael's chill and confident expression vanished. However, seeing Liam and the directors of the art program standing across from Jacob, he didn't dare to cause trouble and had to hold back his rage. He couldn't understand how this rival, who was insignificant a month ago, became so much more influential than him in such a short time. Besides great strength, this rival of his had even attracted so many pretty ladies to his side, despite the plain look and the ordinary background.
Why? Why?
Michael cried in his mind. Jacob's sharp eyes caught the minuscule change on Michael's face. He withdrew his arms from the twin sisters' hands and looked disapprovingly at them. Jade and Julia stuck their tongues out at each other before giggling. It seemed like they had done it on purpose to make someone jealous. On the other side, the girls spotted Tom in the suit and rushed toward him, shrieking. The security guards immediately blocked them with their arms. Accompanied by many influential figures in the art circle, Tom slowly took off his suit jacket and revealed the white shirt underneath. The white shirt was thin and fitting, highlighting his muscular body. It again made the girls cheer in excitement. Next, a slightly devilish smile appeared on his face, and the usually quiet library was filled with a round of collective screams instantly. Michael was a little dazed and thought,
"This is what people call charisma."
Today's exhibition showcases the Impressionist paintings that Mr. Lester has painted in the past several years for the first time, and it represents his formal entrance into the field of Impressionist painting. As you all know, Mr. Lester's oil paintings have won him a great reputation in the world, and the average auction price for one of his oil paintings has reached $2 million. The host, in a tuxedo, walked out with a microphone and introduced Tom to everyone. An average of $2 million for one painting? Damn, the world is full of rich people, Jacob thought. Now that Mr. Lester has begun to focus his attention on Impressionist paintings, his global reputation will bring our art to the world. I'm sure that he will make Impressionist paintings the hottest collection items in the eyes of international buyers. The great artists in the art circle here today all agreed that Mr. Lester's skills in terms of Impressionist painting have reached a very high level. At our persistent request, Mr. Lester will paint on the spot to show his passion for Impressionist paintings. Please watch and enjoy. After saying that, the host backed off and the lights in the library were suddenly turned off. A spotlight lit up the area where Tom was standing. Two girls set up his canvas and other supplies for him. The sound of melodious music appeared, and the spotlight moved to another girl who was playing the violin. The atmosphere was now completely relaxed. The girls had stopped screaming, and they looked at Tom with wide eyes. Tom tossed aside the hair in front of his forehead with a slight shake of his head, and he slowly rolled up his sleeves, revealing his muscular arms. Tom lifted the brush with one hand and made an elegant stroke of bold red on the canvas. His movements were sometimes light and sometimes heavy, and his strokes danced with the music produced by the violin. Tom's fans held their breath, afraid that they would make a sound and interrupt the beautiful scenery. Jacob also quietly watched Tom paint while Jade and Julia stood close to him on both sides. Kathy and her friend widened their eyes, since it was the first time that they watched someone paint such an intricate painting in such a short while. Due to Sophie's lack of height, she had to stand on her tiptoes but still couldn't see. Therefore, Helen had to secretly boost her up with invisible energy. Susan stood beside Sophie with her hands together, and her face was expressionless. Nobody seemed to notice how much time had passed, as everyone was spellbound by the beautiful, completed painting that now stood in front of them. After a significant amount of time had passed, the music slowly came to an end. Tom also put down his brush before straightening his body. His white shirt was still spotless, which was quite an achievement in itself. And, just like that, the lights were back. Two girls stepped forward and carefully lifted the painting while the paint was still wet. The vice president of the Artists Association, a white-haired and high-spirited old man, was the first one to applaud him.
"This is one of the most beautiful pieces I've seen here, and to think that you made it in front of everybody."
With his applause, the other influential figures in the art circle all showed their appreciation as well. With a slight smile, Tom took the painting from the girls before walking into the crowd. He said, with his magnetic voice, "Sue, this painting is for you."
Wow!
The girls realized that Tom was taking this chance to show his love.
But who is this Sue?
They all wondered. With the painting in his hands, Tom made his way through the crowd and stopped right in front of Susan. A bright smile was on his face. Susan looked at the painting before taking it from his hands. Then she slowly tore it into pieces. Episode 159, Jacob's Masterpiece. All of the people there were stunned. It was a painting that the genius artist Tom Lester had made right before their eyes, and it was the first painting that he had ever done in public. With its significance and reputation, the painting was worth at least $1 million. But an ordinary lecturer tore it into pieces?
Good try.
Susan dropped the torn pieces of the painting from her hands and said lightly. Her eyes were as sharp as lightning. She would never change her determination in pursuing the ultimate goal of cultivation. Tom's effort of dissuasion was an insult to her. "Susan, what did you do?" Oblivious to the situation, the principal hurried over and scolded Susan. Surprisingly, Tom was not angry. He lifted his hand to stop the principal and smiled graciously. "It was just a casual painting. I don't mind that it was torn. However, Ms. Sue does have quite a temper." Still angry, the principal said to Susan, "Come to my office after the exhibition." In his mind, Susan usually stayed in her office and rarely showed her face on campus. However, she was a good and responsible teacher. But today, her behavior brought disgrace to the university. Susan knew that Tom was trying to make her lose her job in the mortal world. She caught Liam's apologetic gaze and said, after a moment of consideration, "It's just a painting. I will repay you with another." Then she stepped forward to the painting desk. The teachers and students all knew her, and they stepped aside to let her pass. Everyone gasped and wondered, "Susan paints? And she is ready to compensate the genius Tom Lester with one? Does she think she can paint that well?" Slowly, Susan lifted the brush, looked around, and called out,
"Jacob, come here. I will teach you how to paint."
Jacob was stunned at this sequence of events. "Why does this woman want to kill me? I can't even draw a proper circle." Seeing everyone turning to look at him, Jacob panicked. Susan just stood there waiting for him. "Come on, go up." Michael was the first to yell. Then, the other guys followed suit and yelled jeering encouragement.
"Hey, go on. You'll be fine."
Sophie, who was behind him, said in a calming voice. Jacob nodded at her and gulped the lump that had formed in his throat. He had to force himself to go forward to the painting table. Susan stepped aside and handed the brush to Jacob. The two girls, who had been helping Tom, stepped up and spread out another canvas. Feeling hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, Jacob was nervous. He whispered to Susan, "What are you doing?" Then the lights went off like before, and a spotlight illuminated Jacob and Susan in front of the desk.
Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. When I say one element, you must use this element. I'll tell you a number with the element. Like if I tell you 1, you must use 1/10 of your strength. So on and so forth,
Susan whispered. Then she stepped to one side and handed the color palette to Jacob. Everyone was intrigued to see where this sudden turn of events would lead.
Calm down and concentrate. Recall Tom's hand movements when he drew the painting. Do you remember each stroke?
Susan asked. They whispered to each other in front of the desk, at least half a meter away from the crowd. Therefore, no one could hear them.
Yes, I do.
Jacob nodded. He had a great memory to begin with, and he could remember everything he had seen after breaking through to the 3rd level of the Spirit Concentration Scroll.
Metal 6,
Susan said. Jacob activated the Sword Shadow Scroll, and a pure yet weak metal elemental sword energy shot out of his fingertip before traveling into the tip of the brush. The paint went with the stroke of Jacob's wrist before splashing onto the canvas, in the same manner it had done when Tom was painting.
Good use of essence,
Susan praised silently. However, the students who were watching couldn't see anything special about it. They thought Jacob was just imitating Tom's movement, and they booed at him slightly. However, the influential artists were slightly shocked, thinking, "What a sharp stroke!"
The second stroke, water 7.
Jacob copied Tom's second stroke from memory, and the brush splashed the paint on the canvas. The force of the water elements threw the ink drops out continuously.
Smooth!
The influential artists, especially the masters who focused on Impressionist paintings, froze.
Everything in the world is made from the 5 elements. The third stroke, wood 3,
Susan said. The brush in Jacob's hand began to make dots like crazy.
Fire 2.
Little black drops appeared like the stars in the night sky.
Earth 8. Water 4. Metal 9. From top to bottom, be deep and powerful.
Metal elements were sharp and lethal. Wood elements represented life. Water elements combined firmness and flexibility. Fire elements could light up the world. And earth elements were so thick that they could carry everything. The 5 elements in Jacob's body took turns as Susan issued instructions. The audience watched Jacob move with smooth strokes while Susan stood beside him elegantly.
Susan, I can't do it anymore,
Jacob said, feeling that the 5 elemental essences in his body were depleting. The continuous transitions and conversions of the 5 elements were quite energy-consuming. Besides, he had to infuse the 5 elemental sword energies into the brush before each stroke, which was exhausting on its own. After all, he had a very low cultivation value, and he had been continuously releasing sword energies with the Sword Shadow Scroll. Big drops of sweat flowed down his face, and his arm that was holding the brush was shaking slightly.
Water 7.
Abruptly, Susan commanded and stood behind Jacob, with her right hand holding onto Jacob's right hand. Jacob felt a surge of pure water elemental essence entering his body through his arm, and he immediately absorbed it with the Sword Shadow Scroll before releasing it.
Wood 5. Convert it by yourself.
Susan injected a surge of pure metal and water elemental essences into Jacob's arm. Jacob took a deep breath and circulated the Sword Shadow Scroll at a great speed, converting these essences into the wood elements. The light color gave the painting a sense of liveliness. Meanwhile, people gasped at the scene. Susan was holding on to Jacob's hand while they painted together. Jacob and Susan both lifted their arms with the brush, and a streak of rainbow appeared at the top of the painting. It was finished. The two girls stepped forward and gently lifted the canvas up.
Looking up at the high mountain and walking on the wide road. Excellent, excellent.
The white-haired vice president of the Artists Association applauded. After his comments, other people began to understand the spirits expressed in the painting. The highest level of landscape paintings valued not the techniques, but the spirit and meaning. Compared with Tom's painting in calligraphy, the painting drawn together by Susan and Jacob was better in its portrayal of the spirit. The surging river and rolling clouds depicted the spirits of the valley and mountains. The spirit expressed in this painting was Susan's response to Tom.
The road ahead is long, and I won't stop exploring and searching.
Tom's face turned pale, and his body shook all over. The sharp rejection Susan gave him through the painting was one reason for his reaction, but the significant reason was the sight of Susan and Jacob drawing the painting together.
I didn't know Jacob was such a great painter.
Standing beside Kathy, her friend said in surprise. And Sam and his buddies, standing in the crowd, were all stupefied, thinking Jacob had disguised himself so well that they thought he couldn't paint to save his life. Sophie put her fingers on her lips while she studied the beautiful painting. She turned to ask Helen,
Did Jacob really make that?
Yeah, Helen smiled.
He's amazing, isn't he?
Sophie didn't hear her mother's question as she was too busy gaping at the masterpiece her fiancé had just created in front of her eyes.
This is for you.
Susan placed it into Tom's hands. Tom's face turned red with embarrassment and then changed to livid. He wanted to burn it into ashes right now, but he forced himself to control his rage, considering his public image. Then, he held the painting for a second before handing it to his assistant beside him. Episode 160. Late Night Revisions. The art program in this university is indeed full of talented students. Are there any other students or teachers who want to come up and show their talent? The host walked up with a microphone and tried to smooth things over. At the same time, the director, vice directors, and professors of the art program looked at each other in mortification, since none of them knew a talented student named Jacob in their program. The painting made by Jacob was so brilliant, even students in the art program didn't dare to be so audacious in front of the world-famous artists. When no one came forward, the small Anyone Can Paint event was put to an end, and the students began to scatter around to see the exhibition. People of the art circle went to a prearranged quiet corner to have a tea and chat with Tom and the officials of the art program. In the chaos, Jacob slipped back into the crowd before joining Sophie and the others. Jade and Julia sneakily reached the painting desk and started messing around with the paint on a smaller canvas while laughing with each other. Jacob looked around but couldn't find Jade and Julia. Seeing that Helen was about to take Sophie home, he offered to walk them out. Helen's car was parked in front of the stairs leading up to the library. The sports car was quite eye-catching at night. "You guys have a safe trip home," Jacob said with a wave after Helen and Sophie got in the car.
"Thank you. All the best for your test tomorrow,"
Helen said with a smile. Sophie gave him one last smile and silently waved goodbye. not wanting to say anything in front of her mom. The car started and drove toward the main gate of the school. Jacob turned around and was about to return to his dorm for the test preparation when he suddenly saw Jade and Julia standing right behind him. Startled, Jacob jumped back subconsciously.
Master, you did good with the use of the Sword Shadow Scroll.
Julia praised him. Thanks. Jacob nodded. In fact, he tried his best tonight. He didn't expect that it would be so exhausting to transfer the 5 elemental essences continuously while controlling the strength of the sword energies.
Master, what are your plans for tonight?
They asked. What plans? Confused, Jacob asked. What are they planning? He thought.
Prepare for the tests with us,
the sisters answered at the same time. Like in a magic trick, they dug out 2 small bags that contained books and notebooks. You don't have to go back home? Jacob asked.
Elder Liam has arranged a room for us, and we could live on campus,
they explained with smiles on their faces. Jacob sighed and gave in. Okay, I'll study with you. Jade and Julia smiled at each other and said,
Then we'll walk you to the dorm for your notes.
Feeling like a hostage, Jacob smiled powerlessly before leading them to the dorm area. They crossed the campus and arrived at Jacob's dorm building. Jacob asked them to wait outside while he went in to get his notes. It was very quiet in the dorm tonight since everyone was cramming for tomorrow's test. The same was true for Jacob's dorm. His friends had come back from the exhibition and were sitting at their desks, busy reading Kathy's notes. Seeing that Jacob was back, they all looked at him as if they were observing a strange beast, since they had not yet recovered from the shock they got from his performance in the library. Jacob didn't want to explain anything, since he needed to put every minute he had into preparing for tomorrow's midterm tests. Picking up the photocopied notes that Kathy had given him, Jacob grabbed 3 jackets before hurrying out of the dorm. The study rooms were very cold during the night. Although he knew that Jade and Julia could withstand the cold since they lived in the Ice Palace for more than 200 years, he felt it was not gentlemanlike to only get a jacket for himself. Jacob, where are you going at this late hour? Seeing Jacob rushing out, Sam yelled after him. Jacob didn't hear him as he was already out of the door. Sam walked to their room's balcony and saw the twins standing near the entrance of their building. He realized what was happening and thought, It's like he's always with one or another girl these days. He hardly spends any time with us. Back downstairs, Jacob handed the sisters the jackets before putting on his.
Thank you.
After putting on Jacob's jackets, Jade and Julia said gratefully. Jacob smiled, his mind on tomorrow's test. In the past month, he had focused his attention only on cultivation and tutoring Sophie. Thus, he missed many key concepts in class. If he had not borrowed Kathy's notes, he suspected that he would fail the tests miserably. Crossing the quiet campus, Jacob led them to study rooms. Their college had a few spare rooms for the purpose of group study and discussions. These rooms were usually open until 10 o'clock, but the rooms were open 24/7 during the test seasons. Spotting a big room that was relatively less crowded, Jacob walked inside with Jade and Julia. Okay, let's sit here. Jacob found a corner and sat down. He took the study materials out of his bag and spread them on the desk. Meanwhile, in the temporary resting room in the library, a staff member came over with a small canvas and asked, carefully, Mr. Lester, did you forget to mount and display this painting? This, Tom hesitated and replied, doesn't look like mine. Where did you find it? It was left on the painting desk, the staff member answered. Curious, the art masters who had been having tea and chatting with Tom leaned over to look. The moment they saw what was on the canvas, they froze as if they had been electrocuted by lightning. There were 3 bamboos, and they looked so lively that it seemed like they were swaying out of the paper. It should belong to heaven instead of appearing in the mortal world. What was more, the artistic masters saw a painting of a sunset beside the bamboos. There were no inscriptions or signatures on it, so no one knew who drew them. The paintings of such simple objects looked extraordinary, even to the most talented painters in the room.
This university is full of talented people.
The art masters who had been studying Impressionist paintings for many years were all stunned into silence. Just when the great artists were stunned by the 3 bamboos in the painting, Jade and Julia, the owners of those masterpieces, were preparing for their tests with Jacob in a study room in Academic. The sunset and the 3 bamboos were a result of their casual brushstrokes. However, the staff panicked, thinking that the bamboos were Tom's work and the small picture of a sunset in the corner was someone's prank that ruined the masterpiece. Now, wearing Jacob's jacket, the sisters were sitting together and talking about the notes while comparing them to the content in the textbooks. They were serious with their preparations. They were sitting close together, and their confused expressions and earnest attitudes surprised Jacob. He glanced at their textbooks and found that these books were mostly liberal arts subjects. He didn't think that the tests would be challenging to the smart sisters. Occasionally, they were puzzled by some technical terms. However, they would soon understand them after discussing them among themselves. As to the difficult ones, they would ask Jacob for an explanation. Jacob found it funny that the sisters would be taking tests in the mortal world. Time ticked by, and Jacob had almost finished preparing for tomorrow's test with the photocopied notes that Kathy gave him. He had mastered cramming for tests. He could cover a half-term's content in one night and get passable scores. This time, with Kathy's notes, it was much easier for him to prepare. Jade and Julia had also finished reviewing all the textbooks for the film program. In fact, equipped with their photographic memories, they could even rewrite the books if they wanted to. The problem for them was that they didn't know how to approach and answer the questions that might be asked on the tests, since it was their first time taking them. Since they wanted to keep Jacob company, they had to stay in school. Therefore, they had to pass the tests so as not to get kicked out. "It's almost midnight now. Are you done with your preparations?" After flipping through the notes one more time, Jacob checked his watch before asking them.
Yeah.
Jade and Julia both nodded. "Let's go." Jacob packed up his stuff and stood up. The campus was quiet, illuminated by the dim light of the street lamps. Liam had specially arranged a 2-bed dorm for Jade and Julia in the postgraduate residence area located next to the cafeteria. While Jacob walked them back to their dorm, it suddenly occurred to him that since the sisters were both mid-tier 7th level master, and he was only at half 1st level, he was not qualified to walk them to their dorm as a bodyguard. However, he was a guy, and it was his duty to walk the girls to their dorm.
"Master, good night. Thank you for your help today."
Standing at the door to the dorm building, Jade and Julia waved at Jacob. "Good night." Jacob smiled at them before turning to leave. Even though there was dim light coming from the street lamps, most of the campus was dark. Jacob kept alert while walking back to his dorm. "What? Are you afraid I might attack you?" Tom, dressed in a suit, suddenly appeared in the darkness.